All right. Welcome to Microcollege. This week on the podcast, we are really excited to have a couple of guests from Canada, Philippe Mesly and Julia Henderson. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having us. We're excited to be here.
Yeah, definitely our pleasure.
Great. Yeah. So right at the beginning here, I want to mention that one of the reasons we're speaking with Philippe and Julia is that Philippe it will be coming to Thoreau College, to Viroqua here in January and February to offer a 6-week course on philosophy and literature with the theme of the organic metaphor in politics. So if you're listening to this in late 2023, check this out and consider coming. This is a great way for a deep dive for a shorter period of time here at Thoreau College. Of course, that's going to involve some reading and some discussion, some academic writing, as well as hands-on experiences with crafts, and a week-long winter expedition here in Wisconsin. So if reading some and discussing some big ideas and some serious texts, living in community, and really challenging yourself in the elements sounds appealing, this is a great opportunity for you. So we're going to talk more about that course, but I just want to get that right up front. Check out the Thoreau College website. This is our winter program, The Organic Metaphor in Politics. So, yeah, I think, Philip, maybe could you give us a thumbnail introduction to yourself here so we can get a sense of where you're coming from?
Sure. My name is Philip. I am very excited to be teaching this program at Thoreau coming up soon. How I guess I came to connect with you, Jacob, and with Thoreau is that Julie and I together are launching we call it an institute that is going to be based out of Southern Ontario. It's called the Great Lakes Institute, and in many ways, I think it reflects some of the priorities that Thoreau has outlined. But it also reflects some of our priorities and interests and things that we think are really necessary and valuable today. So, so together we are the organizers of the Great Lakes Institute, and that's sort of my primary thing these days. And that involves organizing study groups, offering some workshops and hands-on programs, and we're leading up to hopefully a semester-long summer program next year.
Yeah, great.
But in general, I guess our main priority is to foster a kind of independent and regionally focused intellectual community, which can hopefully meet some of the needs of our current time, as well as provide different kinds of intellectual resources and programming to what's currently offered in the university.
Yeah, great. We'll dive into all of that in great depth. And also, I'd like to, Julia, could you introduce yourself?
Absolutely. So I'm coming onto the project a little later than Philip. Though we have been friends for maybe 10 years and share a lot of the same interests. I myself I have been in academia for maybe 10 years now. I studied predominantly poetry and literature at University of Toronto. And then recently I have just finished up another master's at this tiny little institute called the Institute for Christian Studies. Which is a strange little place in Toronto that is founded by a group of reformational philosophers from this sort of strange Dutch Calvinist philosophical background, of which I am not, but I go to this school because they are doing a little more of this sort of the kind of integration between different subjects and different practices that I'm really interested in. I study a lot of, right now, Simone Weil and some of the sort of 13th, 14th century Christian mystic women. whose works were sort of doing a lot of this. They were interested in what you might call like the contemplative and the meditative and these like similar, perhaps, although very differently written to their scholastic counterparts, like the Franciscans and the Cistercians and things. But at the same time, they were very interested in sort of engaging with their communities in the form of hospitals and, you know, helping the sick and caring for the poor. And that sort of dual impulse, the contemplative work with this like this social sort of active arm into the world, which you see in Simone Weil a lot as well, who I just finished my thesis on. That is like very, very inspiring me, and to kind of inspired my decision to come on in a more active role in the Great Lakes Institute. So yeah, so I that's me. That's my background. That's why I'm here. And yeah.
Cool. Thank you. Yeah, that's some fascinating stuff to bring into
Mm.
this work for sure. Simone Weil, we had a wonderful discussion of gravity and grace here a year or so ago that was very inspiring to many of us here. So very, very interesting strands. So I want to take a couple of steps back here. If anyone who's listened to the Microcollege podcast knows that we like to ground our conversations in people's biographies, especially their biographies of their young adulthood. I'm wondering if each of you would care to reflect for a little bit about your life, where you were when you were 18, 19, 20 years old. What were you doing? What was shaping your life and your identity and your experience of the world during that time period? What really stands out from this point in time? Julia,
Philip,
you want to start?
do you want to go first, or do you want me to jump in? Me? Okay. Well, I suppose the first thing I should say is that both Philip and I grew up in Georgetown, Ontario, which is a it's a relatively small suburban town, no public transit, fairly isolated from the other nearby cities, a very kind of rural surrounding environment. So we grew up there, and for me, I'll say for me personally, the benefit of being in that kind of environment, it's sort of mixed. There's not a lot of anonymity, which is nice because community is sort of it's almost a given because everyone knows you. But at the same time, as young kids, as me as a young person interested in literature and being an angsty teen in general, you can kind of feel a little bit stifled in those spaces. And I found this local used bookstore nearby that I think for both of us became really like a haven that we spent a lot of time in, where we started, I started reading these texts, mostly literature, that kind of just like expanded my world in an exponential way. And after that, I moved to Toronto, to the big city. And I feel like, especially between 19 and 22, I was really, really desperate to try and find a way back into some sense of that combination of of community that was intimate, that is local, but with this desire for engaging with the world in such a way that is sort of this global and branching out and historical. And for me, actually, that happened a lot in Toronto in local coffee shops, these sort of like third spaces in the big city that became very like small local communities in and of themselves, and meeting like minds there, fellow students and scholars going to different universities in the city, where we would sort of collect and we would do communal work. And I worked at this coffee shop, so I would spend the mornings working, making things for people, giving them coffee, feeding them, and then I would sit on the other side of the counter and I would have people give me coffee and feed me and read my texts, and we would have all these scholarly conversations. So that is how I got through university. That's how I got through. I was a little bit older when I went back to university. I was maybe, it doesn't sound that old, but 22, 23 when I went back to U of T, and I had a hard time connecting in class. And so it was this sort of secondary community that really allowed me to feel at home in the city, and really, really like challenged the way that I thought and the things I was engaging with, and were introducing me to all these new texts and new ideas. So yeah, so that's where I was located in those years, and it was I was very rooted. It was really space based. That kind of small community was really important to me. So I don't know if that quite answers your question, but that's
Perfectly.
where I was.
Yeah, I mean, so much of what we're talking about here has to do with creating the spaces and those,
Exactly.
the communities of different forms, right? And so it's great to be reminded that can happen in the city as well, right?
It
People,
can. It
yep.
can, although it's like I feel like COVID happened, and some of those spaces, not all of them, some still are there, but certainly things started shifting after 2020, with justifiably a lot of businesses needed to find ways to survive, and that meant sometimes not always choosing to foster that community feel as much. Although luckily the place I used to go is still running, still kicking. So
Nice. Beautiful. Thank you. What about you, Philip?
Yeah, I appreciate Julia bringing up our hometown, Georgetown. I think there's definitely something there to do with the lack of anonymity, which is interesting because the way I experienced our hometown, which was in a period of pretty rapid transition while we were growing up, and I think at this point almost doesn't even exist anymore in the same way. It's become sort of the suburb of a suburb, as the city has slowly sprawled towards it. But I recall the town as kind of anonymous itself, that it was a sort of no place. And when we were growing up, I don't think anybody really bothered to teach us sort of where we were, what were the peculiarities of this place, and what was the right way to live there, by comparison with living somewhere else. So it was just sort of this large no man's land, and I think that gave it this sense of unreality. And I think I certainly experienced, the real tangible world as kind of unreal. And part of what led me to fall in love with art and literature and philosophy was that it took me to, I think, a much more real place. But at the same time, these new havens, as it were, as Julia put it, were kind of stigmatized, at least in my early days. I was, based on my upbringing, I was encouraged to not, try to sound too smart, not to talk too much about books. It was pretentious. It was, um, uppity or whatever, and I should just sort of mind my own business and stay in my lane or whatever. So when we left, and I initially moved to Halifax and studied at King's, and I think unlike a lot of people who are on this podcast, who entered university and found something that was cold and that they became disillusioned with, I in fact accidentally found myself in a terrific program for which I was not at all at a place to really appreciate, I think, what I had. But I took the foundation year program at King's College in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and it's an extraordinary program that really gave me this incredible foundation in the texts that I think influence so much of each other and of the world that we still live in. So I really appreciate that. But then that first year ended. That first year Great Books program ended, and first I dropped out, and then I came back, and so on. But I discovered that to continue in the university and to do well, was not about learning necessarily, and it wasn't about loving the text, which is something, which is the way of relating that I think I would have naturally fallen into. But I discovered that it was the way to succeed was to be a scholar, like in the professional sense of the word. And then I just, I went ahead and adopted the techniques of the scholar and did decently well. But then I graduated, and the sort of anti-intellectualism that I had inherited continued to weigh on me, and I felt like, I really needed to do something practical, something useful, that it was enough. And I had carried this, I think, the whole way through, working several jobs while pursuing my studies and so on. And I always felt kind of guilty for reading so much. But so anyway, so I worked for a few years, first for the government, and then as what I view as a fairly widespread environmental crisis began to become more apparent to me, I started shifting my attention to that, and I slowly transitioned my career into environmental activism, and completed a master's in environmental studies. But I think that now, as we're moving forward, I've tried to draw as much as possible from the lessons that I've had, which is not to feel shame for bookishness or for a conceptual approach to things, but more than anything, to see the ways that there actually is quite a bit of synergy between an intellectual approach to certain issues and a practical or embodied one. And so in that sense, I'm grateful for the experience that I had, because I think that by pushing myself into some experiences that I wouldn't otherwise have had, I've come to see how these things work together. And so in particularly recently, I've been working primarily as a gardener, and that's been fantastic. And I really see in gardening the kind of sort of convergence of all these different strands of human life that are really incredibly bound up in the act of gardening. You know, it helps if you know Latin, so you can know the words. So there's like the classics element, right, of all the different names of things, the plants and stuff. But then you also need a kind of intuitive and really embodied technique to treat the plants with care, but also the right, decisiveness to make the pruning cuts that are necessary, or to uproot the plant that's dying and spreading disease or things like that. And then at the same time, there's an artistry that it's involved. You have to have certain design skills, to place flowers in a pot just right, or to arrange your plants in the plot. So I really love this craft that combines for me aesthetics with a kind of physical, personal, and bodily relationship with other species. And it also involves quite a bit of learning, learning plant science as well as history and the culture of different cultural uses of different plants. So that's kind of where I've arrived now, and this experience of convergence, I think, is guiding quite a bit of what I do now.
Yeah, that's very beautifully put. Yeah, I'm thinking, you're talking about pruning. The period of this this winter program here at Thoreau will be, it's not gardening season exactly. The snow will probably be on the ground. But one thing that does happen at that time of year is pruning. So we have fruit trees and vineyard here, and I've always found that to be one of the most, training, great kind of thought-provoking and and also just trainings of certain inner qualities, especially those of decisiveness, but also sculptural, it's artistic, and and it is something I always, whenever I've got a student or person I'm working with who's has a hard time making decisions, you have them do some pruning, because you gotta cut or
Definitely.
not cut. There's no midway ground, and you got to do it over and over and over again. So I really hear what you're saying about yeah, the resonances between that type of, the consciousness that's needed to be a gardener, and to work with plants in that way, and intellectual kind of, yeah, and ideas and books. Beautiful. Yeah. So great. Okay. So thank you for those biographies and those pictures into your origin stories. I'm wondering if, yeah, now if you could, the Great Lakes Institute is emergent organization that you're working to found there in Ontario. Yeah, can you describe it? What is emerging here, and what is the origin story of this project?
Um, sure. So I think the way it worked, in my mind and in conversations with other people, is that we started with a long-term vision, and we've since been kind of working our way back and trying to find the steps that will lead us there. And that long-term vision has also changed and been modified over time. And I think a lot of people have been involved in the shape that it currently has. But the way that I see it right now is that ultimately, the Great Lakes Institute it's just a name that we, have given to what would ultimately be a series of interconnected programs and self-created and organized programs, basically in the liberal arts and operating out of a farm. So the dream would be to have some land given over to the Great Lakes Institute that could be operated as an organic farm. And for either young people who would prefer to do something, in the vein of what I've mentioned, that combines both the kind of intellectual cultivation that you would receive in the university, and in particular in humanities programs, together with some hands-on work, in a way that is typically separated into different institutions, would be able to come to the Great Lakes Institute and get some of that cultivation there. At the same time, the Institute would be open to more advanced scholars who would want to come, not necessarily needing a groundwork in the humanities or anything, but to come do a residency and run some kind of self-directed program, and using the resources that are available. So whether it's doing a reading group or giving a seminar or simply writing a book and having people look at it, or maybe, hosting interviews or what have you, that would be open to whatever the scholar is interested in. But the core of it, I think, is that it operates out of this farm, and everybody who participates in the intellectual activity is also participating in the work. And the sale of foods, whether by CSA or some other kind of model that we'll figure out, will help support the work. And I think that you know, many hands make light work, and the idea being that, you know, intellectual work in the liberal arts doesn't necessarily produce a product, and therefore it has to figure out different kinds of arrangements for how to fund itself in a society that's primarily market oriented. And so one of them has been to charge tuition, which is very expensive, or to receive grants on the assumption that you're creating new knowledge or something like that, which I think is a problematic assumption. So the model that we're sort of proposing is simply that you do a certain amount of work, and that frees up your time. And I think that this is possible in a way that historically has not been, because we have made certain advances in science, you know, understanding our soil a lot better than farmers did previously, as well as having developed new kinds of tools and, you know, borrowing the term from Ivan Illich, convivial tools, things that we can operate without getting into enormous debt. But that also make, I mean, like the bicycle is one of Illich's famous examples. This is a very recent invention, and it's a vehicle that allows us to get around multiple orders of speed faster than on foot, and yet with no fuel required. So tools like this exist in farming, and have been discussed at length. You know, like there's a little market garden out of Quebec that's really been pushing this tool called the broad fork, the grelinette, they call it. You know, there's like these new approaches to food production, I think ought to be implemented not so as to you know, make new kinds of market intrusions, but to lead to the kind of good life that historically is what human beings have been looking for, at least some of us. So those of us who are interested can give it a shot. Yeah, but I think the one of the distinctions between the Great Lakes Institute and some of the other projects that you might have been interviewing is that it's not necessarily a school in the same way. We haven't given it the name of a school or a college, because I think what's most important here is that we try to recognize that there are some people who have an intellectual or a spiritual vocation that isn't quite being met in any other institution, unless you know you're becoming a professional in some way. You know, a professional priest or a professional scholar, you know, university professor or something like that, which increasingly I think in these you know, mega institutions are unsatisfying, I suppose. But Paul Goodman wrote in a book in the 60s, The Community of Scholars, he predicted that, you know, as the bulk of administration became so unbearable, what was most likely, or the question he asked was like, when is it going to be the time for the community of scholars, which has always existed, to essentially pack up and move to the wilderness, as they have done historically, time and time again. And I think I read that and I thought, well, I guess that's what I'm doing. I didn't know that I was, but I've also met many other people who've expressed a similar sentiment, and so I think that we're all kind of discovering that the time is ripe. But I think that we also need to acknowledge that it is impossible to do alone. Yeah. So that's where the farm comes in. And the farm itself has enormous value, I think, also on the kinds of intellectual work that get done. And this, I think, is something that we'll be talking about in the program at Thoreau, on the organic metaphor in politics, is the extent to which so many of the authors of the books that we read, if they were written more than 100 years ago, have had a completely different experience of life, and I think would be hard pressed to understand how modern university professors can believe that they're reading them properly when they haven't had to walk through fields to get to another person's house, or when they haven't had the kinds of contact with the earthly world that they did.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is that I think many of the authors of the books that make it onto Great Books programs, and we could talk about the revision of the canon, which I'd also like to introduce, because I have some issues with the idea of Great Books. But regardless, many of those authors have had a much more earthly existence than I think most contemporary university professors. And so living with your hands in the soil, I think, makes you better capable of interpreting those books.
Yeah, that's a powerful statement. It really, of course, resonates with our our connection with Thoreau and the American Transcendentalists. I mean, Emerson and Thoreau both emphasize the importance for physical experiences, manual labor experiences in nature for our language, right? So much of language is built up out of organic metaphors or images that are drawn from embodied experience. And and I certainly, one of the things I love about doing the farm work and the other manual skills that we do with our students here is how often you can say, okay, here, a couple months ago, we were being introduced to draft oxen by a local woman who trains oxen. And, here is an ox bow, right? Here's a yoke, right? And, just think about, like, where does that play out in our language, and things that are entirely invisible if you haven't actually, you haven't in some way engaged with the trades or with the soil or with the forest in some way. So that's that really resonates. That our language, our thinking is impoverished if we are only on paper on a screen, right? Yeah. So what you're talking about, this sense of the people who have a vocation towards to the intellectual, to the spiritual life, packing up for the wilderness and forming a community, right? This has happened before in several places in the world. And so I think things that I see in your language and in your writing also invokes the monastic tradition. And also, Julia, what you were just saying about the medieval mystics and their, people who are also doing, caring for, medical care and communities. So can you, Julia, maybe you could talk about that? What do you bring from your study of the mystics to this work, or from that era?
Yeah, it's a good question. I guess, so first of all, just to locate it a little bit, I would say that primarily I study a group of women called the Beguines. I don't know if you've heard of them before.
Sure, yeah.
Most notably Margaret Perret, who wrote The Mirror of Simple Souls. And then later, sort of a lot of her ideas were picked up by Meister Eckhart, who, for the record, also preached a lot to women groups. Not to say that it's necessarily like a strict gendered divide, anything I'm about to say. I think some scholars would certainly disagree with me, but I'll backtrack a little bit. When I first started studying Simone Weil, I was struck by, like many people are, by the sort of tenacity that she had, and her extreme sense of obligation and responsibility towards the world, sort of mingled with her just incredible ideas and incredible grasp of the Greeks and tragedies and philosophy and mathematics, and that in that one person, these two things were sort of so bound together. And yet, you can see in her life, in the biography of her life, this struggle in which, she leaves the university to work in a factory, and then is injured, and then is devastated because she cannot work. And then she goes to fight in you know, revolutions as a pacifist, and then for her you had the added problem of her health, which was constantly failing her. But you see it in her work, and you see it in her texts, is this sort of her philosophies are always like leaning towards how one can engage actively in the world, and her activity in the world is absolutely rooted and grounded in a sense of her philosophy and her contemplative work and her religion, whatever religion we decide that is for her. So anyways, that is to say that then later I found a similarity in these Beguine mystic women, and I found that for them at least, they lived in these cities, you know, where they cared for the sick and started early versions of hospitals, and yet, you know, wrote these texts which were very different from their male counterparts, but yet still were circulated around and meant to educate and meant to be creation myths and be really inspire the lives of the women, and how they thought of themselves and how they thought of their responsibilities to their communities. And for me, that sort of unity between one's laborious work and one's thinking life, you might say, is so important, because so I have lived in Toronto now for 10 years, and this is a city I don't get much of. I don't see much of the land. Well, what I will say is that I've spent the last 10 years working in hospitality and working in restaurants, working, you know, very physically demanding jobs where you're doing service work, you're serving to people. And I do that in the evenings, and then in the mornings I go to school and I think all day. And then in the evenings I go and I do this physical work, and my mind is not important unless it's, you know, bringing people things and getting things and caring for people. And this sort of, you know, I have two different communities in my life, and I have two different aspects of my life, and that is okay. But the idea, the desire to sort of bring those two things together and unify them, and that there are these, I'm inspired by these histories of these women who were doing this together in community, who were learning together and working together, and so that really grounds my sort of love and desire for participating in a project like this, is even just the idea that I could do those two things in the same place, and they could speak to each other rather than, and speak to each other publicly, speak to each other in a way that I could talk about with my community rather than only separately in this community or that community. So yeah, that's sort of where it's coming from for me in my personal life, and that's where the things that I have been studying. Because like Philip, I have felt, maybe for me, guilt is not the right word, because as a woman in philosophy especially, I've always felt like I didn't belong in the intellectual space, but I did very much belong in the working space, in the serving space, you might say, in that sort of caretaking role. I don't know where I was going with this, but to be able to unify those two things and to feel comfortable. Oh, this is what I was going to say, is that I for a while in my studies, I tried to just be the intellectual, and I wanted to leave behind working hospitality. Oh, the day that I can no longer have a part-time job, you know, serving at a restaurant, that was the dream, that was the goal. And lately, in the last few years, reading these texts, I have come to love that is an integral part of who I am now, and that I don't want to take that part and put it, I don't want to just be in this other space. And so actually learning to not be ashamed of that work and learn to bring that into my intellectual pursuits, that has been like a big shift for me recently. Yeah.
Beautiful, powerful. I think that my sense is that, you know, when I learned about the Great Lakes Institute from Philip, and you know, just some of the inspirations and the way that you were talking about it, you know, it fit for me into a sense, something that I hear more and more of is an interest in the monastic kind of traditions of different parts of the world, and not necessarily from, and generally not from a religious perspective, right? These are not people who are, you know, people may have their own spiritual quests in one way or another, but fundamentally for the structure of life, right? And
Yes.
a sense of community that's represented there. And there's a yearning that is popping up in surprising places around this model, which is, you know, for a time it's kind of receded in the culture in a way.
Yes. Yes. And
Yeah,
I
but
think it's so necessary now. Anyways, go on, Philip. Sorry.
I think there's another uh, source of influence on this idea of intentional community. And I think that Julia touched on it a little bit when she discussed how masculine dominated the intellectual space tends to be, and so on. Which is that I think these renewed and revived intellectual communities that we're striving to produce, you know, not only the two of us, but many people around the world, have to look not only at the monastic institution, but also in a way at what I think we disparagingly call like the liberal tradition, because, you know, I mentioned earlier that we can't do it alone, but today doing anything with other people involves doing it with people across difference, right? And so men and women and people of various backgrounds, I think, need to be part of this conversation for it to stop being so sterile, and for it to really to have the life and energy that intellectual conversation needs to have. Any intellectual activity must be pursued in a space of togetherness. You cannot think on your own. As Hannah Arendt put it, when you think on your own, what you're doing is ideology. And so when we talk about intentional community, which is a term that I don't tend to use that often, but I'm using it now to try and put a bit of a spin on it, because the intention that we have to put into it is precisely the intention to live in a plural community, right? Because the trend, I think, overwhelmingly in our time is towards a kind of renewed nativism or identitarianism or something like that. And if that is the trend that wins the day, then not only is intellectual life in grave danger, but also so is, I think, a lot of human lives and a lot of material circumstances. All right. So I see these institutions as really needing to provide a model for how to do the difficult task of intentionally being together, even though we're different. And that's why I think I was referring to a little bit with, you know, the great books tradition, which, in my opinion, is the product of a myth making, of a mythologizing, and you know, the so-called West, which I don't really believe in. I don't believe it even exists. Is a myth, and so our new intellectual institutions need to be intentional in the sense that not only do they embody the rhythm and the humility of monastic traditions, but they also embody the commitment to plurality of the liberal tradition. in our text, in our, in the people who are part of the organization, in our thinking. The last, I think, great period of demystification, demythologization was the late 19th century. And what happened after that was a rebound of extreme proportions towards, people doubling down on certain kind of grand narratives. So as we are existing now in what I think is a period of demythologization as well, which in itself I think is a good thing, but we have to be very, very careful of the temptation to try and get out of the discomfort that it creates in us.
Yeah, so you're talking about a group of people living and studying and working together, with differences between the differences in background and gender and origin and outlook. I think that's, at Deep Springs, which is one of our points of contact, talks about, academics, labor, and self-governance, right? So living in community, living intentionally, right, it requires the cultivation of certain skills and habits and ways of being. And I'm wondering if you have any ideas about the Great Lakes Institute, like what what do you see you'd like to cultivate in order to have that work in a group, the type of community you're thinking about?
I'll try and speak briefly and also ask Julia to give her thoughts on this. But I guess for myself, I would try as hard as possible to resist the tendency of any institution to become crystallized around certain kinds of discourses or schools of thought. I think that every institution, you can't really help it like to 100% degree, but we need to be always vigilant that we're not becoming a clique and not producing an inside-outside dynamic. And for that, if we were to have any kind of school of thought associated with it, I would want it to be leaning towards the skeptical, having a certain kind of built-in resistance to accepting anything too quickly, of becoming too zealous about any particular position, of constantly asking ourselves, well, what are the consequences of this kind of thought, and how would somebody in a different position understand this and react to this and feel about a given idea or book or what have you. So not to be afraid of different kinds of thoughts, but to have a kind of built-in resistance. And I think that part of that is precisely can be embodied in the fact of like actually different people, right? People who do critique one another and fostering that culture of conversation, of being willing to have different stances, but within the framework, I think of a certain kind of, Montaignian, like, okay, let's think about that. Let's not jump in too quickly. A certain patience. Yeah.
I'm gonna, in the spirit of Simone Weil, who loves the sort of tension between opposites and contradictions, I'm gonna actually suggest some, like, for me, what's very important is a spirit of generosity, like the word generosity. I think to be generous, what does it mean? This is like a problem in my life. What does it mean to be generous? What does it mean to be generous in our scholarship? To like, I'm, and I don't know the answers to this, like, but a position of generosity for me when I am engaging with other scholars, with other individuals, which is not to say to not be skeptical or not be critical, but it's something I think about a lot. I think also to answer your question in maybe a more practical manner, I think looking at the terminology and the languages we use and understanding both the value and the problem with references and sort of having our own academic languages that we're referring to, and who in the room knows what we're referring to. Do we even know what the words mean, or are we just using them because we've been trained in certain dialogues? So on a practical level, that is an important aspect for me. But yes, contra to Philip and the skeptical approach, I would say generosity of spirit. It's something that I would hope to move forward with. But I think though, even the very fact that the two of us have this difference here in this moment, that ultimately is so important, right? That there are opposing even motives within the school itself, like to keep it flexible and to keep it malleable and to be in a spirit of friendship and kindness and joy, and that we are perhaps unified only in one way, and that is like a love for what we're doing, but otherwise to sort of be so willing to bend and listen, truly listen, I think. So just to be a
Perfect.
little
I don't see these things as contradictory.
I don't. Yeah, you're right. That's a bold statement on my part. And you know what? We'll talk about it later. We'll think about it.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Yeah, I think one of the things that's really interesting about your project are some of your the names of the thinkers and influences that show up. So we've talked about Simone Weil. I just wanted to mention, if people are wondering that name, they maybe haven't heard it before. It's a French pronunciation of a German looking name. So it's Weil, Simone Weil. Very interesting thinker. We've heard a little bit of Hannah Arendt, and also you've talked about Ivan Illich, who I know is an important thinker for you, Philip, and especially this word conviviality, which you mentioned in connection with the bicycle. And I think in some ways, like, we're talking about being convivial. And I'm wondering if you could expand, just if you'd be open to just a little opening of that term, and what what the thinking of Ivan Illich might bring to this project.
Sure. Ivan Illich ran a school well, I guess not really a school, a center in Mexico for several years, from the mid 60s to mid 70s. And it was going really well, and lots of prominent thinkers from North America and South America, and some from Europe as well, were heading to Mexico just to take seminars there. And one person asked him, this is going so well, like, we'd like to sort of replicate this model in other places. Like, do you think you could give us some guidelines for how you're doing it? And he was like, if you just go out with friends to the bar and drink some beers and talk about books, then you're doing what we're doing. There's no model, right? So I think that Illich emphasized friendship in a lot of his writings, and I think that perhaps that's one way to look at how conviviality enters into an institution, is that you're working with friends first and foremost. Aside from that, there's a lot of interesting political qualities of convivial life. For instance, trying to avoid technologies and practices that every time they're used tend to suck something away from the place where they're used. So every time you use a debit card or a credit card, for instance, the bank is taking some of that money that's being exchanged. So you use cash. That's a more convivial way to do it. For example. yeah, and you know, I think these days can't get away from some of the digital technologies we're using, but to the extent possible, I think that the Great Lakes Institute will emphasize in person and on the ground interactions, and that is precisely for the sake of this conviviality.
Yeah, just think
Yeah,
about the word convivial, right? Just it's kind of obvious. It's right there in the word. It's about living together, right?
right.
It's convivo, and it's a simple idea, except for people are so desperate for it, right? People feel, separated from each other, and certainly the students who end up coming to Thoreau College are, sometimes they're coming out of high school, sometimes they're coming out of another an academic institution. Sometimes they've been out of school for a while and have been really feeling isolated in this kind of digital kind of landscape. And fundamentally, whatever we're doing, talking about books, working in the garden, going camping, like living together is what we're doing above all. And thinking about technologies, forms, kind of habits, qualities of communication that allow that to happen is, I would say, really core to what we're trying to do here and figure out experimentally together.
Right. And, I think perhaps one of the parts of that word that is ignored is the living part. There, it can seem like you're doing enough if you go to events and or chat with people online or something. But if the actual building blocks of life itself are not shared and do not belong to a collective project, if you're receiving all your food delivered to your home and you're working from home, and every part of all of the basics of your life are undertaken alone, then that together that happens as if it's a superfluous thing, I think really lacks precisely that convivial quality, which is what's making people lonely. And loneliness is a terrible thing.
Amen. Yeah. Amen. Yes. Also reminded what Julia was saying about this kind of schizophrenia, doing my thinking over here and doing my working over here, right? I think that's kind of been characteristic of the modern world in a way that's.
Yeah.
I mean, again, Ralph Waldo Emerson has an image of the human being in the modern time being kind of split up into various monstrosities, right? There's a hand
Yes.
over here, a head over here, and they're not a whole person anywhere.
Yeah, I call myself, when I'm in my school mode, I'm a brain on a stick, right? And when I'm in my workspace, I am all body, and I have like 1,000 hands because I'm moving and grabbing and touching and constantly, the only, not the only value, but my value in the workspace is my body, how quickly it can move, how quickly I can bring you physically the thing that you need. And my value in the academic space is not that. And to find a way to live both those lives together, at least. So, speaking of conviviality between people, like between oneself and self, like to have those parts of myself be friendly, and to know how to speak to each other is something that I dream about. I hope one day that we can do that kind of thing. So.
Hey, yeah, indeed. Yeah, great. That's beautiful. So yeah, Philip, I'd love to make a little pivot now to talk really specifically about this winter program. Just to frame this again, the dates are the 15th of January through the 23rd of February 2024. And it's going to be happening here in person, in the flesh, here in Viroqua, Wisconsin. And yeah, you go from there. Can you describe the core idea here and some of the texts you're going to be exploring and ideas that we're going to be working on?
Definitely. I'm super excited about this program. I think it's going to be really awesome, not least because of all the amazing people from Thoreau who are going to be contributing to it. I mean, if you're thinking of applying to this, I think it's incredible value. You're getting not only the academic program, which will involve thinking through some really cool texts and having some great conversations, but you're also getting some amazing craft workshops and this 5-day expedition, as well as just the experience of living together at Thoreau. As far as the organic metaphor in politics, this is a topic that I've become really interested in the past couple of years. And I found that there are many ways of thinking it through, right? But the long and short of it is that the natural, or if you will, living world is at the core, I think, of so much of our thinking about our human life, right? And what I began to observe a couple of years ago is that whenever the term natural was used in a political context, it tended actually not to refer to what's natural at all, but to what's unnatural. And so this word nature and organism always carries a kind of shadow. And I think that in order to properly understand how we stand in relation to the natural world now, which is of incredible importance, we need to face that shadow and look at what it is that we think we are. And to do so, we're gonna be looking at many different texts. And I want to emphasize that when I use the word text, I'm not just referring to books. Part of this initiative is going to be trying to expand the concept of text itself, because the capacity for expression has not been limited to the written word in human cultures. And so in order to really appreciate the many different contributions of different human cultures, we're going to need to expand this concept and look at text meaning something made, and we're going to look at all kinds of things made. We're going to look at physical objects as well as written text, as well as videos and sound. So I think it'll be really fun. But some of the topics we're going to be looking at are the metaphor of a society as a kind of superorganism. What are the implications of that? The most obvious one being that the organism is going to die, because all organisms die. We're going to be looking at the idea of the state of nature, which has informed significantly quite a bit of European thought since the 17th century, and what the contrast, what are the consequences of the ways that we imagine a pre-political life for how we imagine normatively what a political life should look like. We're going to be looking at some of the renewal of animist thought in contemporary times, and what it means to, for instance, try and revise the legal concept of the person to include natural objects. Is this animism or is it not? So policy documents are of interest here. And we're also, I think I'll end with this one, we're going to be looking at the current of natural law or laws of nature. Are they the same? Are they different? And how has the idea of law tended to flip back and forth between the realm of the natural and the realm of the political? And in particular, how has it been used to control human bodies in particular ways? To assume that the ways we're using our bodies are not natural and therefore need to be controlled by human contrivances. it's a very fascinating topic, and I'm really looking forward to going through it with the participants of the winter program. I know everybody who joins will have some amazing contributions, and I think we'll have the chance to learn a lot from each other. So, yeah.
Thank you. Beautiful. Yeah, I think it'll be an extraordinary opportunity for people to pick it up, and really look forward to hearing from you. So yeah, I think that's we've been doing it for about an hour here. So thank you so much, Julia and Philip, for your boldness in going out and exploring this idea such to manifest it in the world, and also for taking some time to share it with us here today. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jacob.
This has been a lovely way to spend part of the afternoon. So thank you.